Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My dear students, in the current session, I would talk about the reinforcement of English language through French. The objective of the session is that by the end of the session, you would be able to understand what role was played by French language in the reinforcement of English during the period from 1500 to 1650. Well, my dear students, if we trace the history of English and we look at the borrowings that were made, that were done through the history, actually it is very, very difficult to tell at what point which word directly came from Latin language and which took a route to come into the language of French. So, which word was directly taken, borrowed, which was borrowed by French, and then it came to English language. Why this was so? Well, there was a reason for that. In fact, a wholesale enrichment process was going on in French language at that time as well. So, in England, the situation was that French language and English, they were both living together, living side by side, being in very close contact. The process of enrichment of both these languages was taking place at the time that we are talking about, that we are concerned with. Now that both are progressing and both are developing, we do not sometimes know in the history of English language at what time which word came through which channel to English language. Why? Because sometimes same words were being introduced, in French language and in English language. Sometimes it was possible that a word would be introduced first in French language and, from French language it would come to English language. But it does not mean that the other possibility did not exist. Sometimes it would be taken independently, from Latin language. Overall, what I would say is that both the streams largely influenced each other and they merged with each other. This was unavoidable. Though the process of these kind of borrowings, the second-hand borrowings were taking place, it does not mean first-hand borrowings were not happening. I would like to give you some examples to make your idea clear. Look at the word fact. The word fact represents the Latin word factum. Now the point is, this French word fait is also there, but the word fact is taken from factum, not having any connections with this word, which was already taken into English at the earlier stages as fate. There are so many examples of verbs as well. I would like to share a few. Notice these. Confiscate, congratulate, exonerate. Well, these are all formed from what we call Latin participles. I am going to give you the example. See, confiscate. The word in Latin language was confiscatus. This was the whole word. By removing this part of the word, the ending of the word confiscate was made. Same is the case with the word congratulate and exonerate, because they were respectively made from congratulator and exonerer. So, the endings, er endings were removed to make them fit into English language. Look at another example. This is the example of the word prejudicate. The form prejudicate is the Latin form. Now, notice this, prejudge. The word prejudge. There is a possibility that it came from prejudicate or it came from the French word, this is the French word, prejuger. So, there has to be some knowledge of the languages, especially the French language and the Latin language, if we want to understand how these processes were taken. So for a layman, probably this is not possible. It is only through specialized studies that it can be done. However, it is interesting and of some use to know how the process was taking place. Notice the two words, instruct and subtract. They have Latin origin, Latin ancestry. They are taken from instructus, us sound at the end. Subtractus, again the ending of US. These two were removed and the words were made to fit into English. The question arises why it was happening so. Why, the French instruer and subtrayer were not there. They would have become in English these words. Instruy, that is like destroy, and subtray. So, which is found in actually the 15th century. So, when we trace, actually, what happens if we have a word in English language? What happens if we trace its history? There is a possibility we find it in French, the origin, or in Latin. Sometimes what we find is that the root is that it comes from French, but in the background is Latin language. And it is only through the knowledge, specialized knowledge, that we can trace the history of each of these vocabulary items. Notice this word, conjugation. Conjugation, this EM at the end was the original part of the Latin word, which was removed to make it the word that we use. And, we also need to notice that the French usual form is conjugation. We can compare it with the word that we have. Sometimes the occurrence of a word in English happens earlier than French, and the example of that is obtuse, which points to the direct adoption from Latin language. Same is the case with the words confidence and confident. By the way, for these words in French language, we again have two words, confiance and confident. And the meanings of these words are different from the meanings of confident and confidence. There are still many words in English that, despite, the channel of the French language, directly come from Latin language. Well, there are verbs like consist or explore that could either come from Latin or they could have taken a French source. You can see the details of the possibilities, but sometimes it is not possible to be sure which route they have taken. Confirmation and conflagration, my dear students, are two other words, which have their roots in Latin language, and again they have these M endings from where they are taken. And by the way, they have their French origin matching to this. Adjectives like affable may represent the Latin affabilis or French affable. So, we are not sure about the origin. Through the process of, borrowing and lending, because the languages are in so much close contact, to, separate the strands sometimes does not remain possible. This is not important whether a word comes through the channel of French language or directly it comes from Latin, because ultimately all these borrowed words come from Latin language. In many cases, French offers a precedence. How? Because a word is taken into French language from Latin language, and from there when it is taken into English, this shift becomes easier, convenient, and more acceptable because, the precedence is there.